Hello everyone. Before we get started, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment letting me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. That way, YouTube knows to keep sharing more stories like this with you. Now, let's jump in. I worked maintenance at a small roadside motel just off US 50, the stretch they call the loneliest road in America. It sat maybe 2 miles east of town, between a half-dead gas station and a shuttered diner that hadn't served food in a decade. The sign out front flickered when the wind hit it right, and the parking lot was always half covered in desert sand. Most nights it was empty except for a few semis or travelers too tired to keep driving through Nevada. The place wasn't much, but it was quiet. My job was to keep it that way. Fix leaky pipes, patch drywall, replace bulbs, unclog toilets. I lived in one of the back rooms next to the supply shed. The owner, a woman in her 60s named Linda, lived up in Fallon and only came by twice a week to collect the receipts and drop off supplies. The rest of the time, it was just me, a handful of rooms, and the sound of the highway fading in and out like a tired pulse. Every week, someone put up missing person flyers on the post near the road. Always the same post, an old weathered one right where the motel driveway met the shoulder. I'd see them in the mornings when I went out to clear the trash or sweep the walkway. Faces of men and women, usually travelers. Some were young, some middle-aged, some with smiles that made you feel worse for knowing what had probably happened to them. Last seen along US 50, the posters said, or traveling west toward Reno. The sheriff's office must have been sick of it. I know I was. They always showed up overnight too. No one ever saw who put them up. The paper would still be damp from the night air, the corners fluttering in the morning wind. Sometimes I'd take them down after a few days when they started peeling off, but every week a new one went up. It became part of the scenery, like the rusted soda machine or the buzzing streetlight that never quite went dark. It was late October when it happened. The air had that dry chill that gets into your bones out here, and the wind came in steady from the desert. It was around midnight. The motel was empty except for one old trucker in room 5, and he'd turned in early. I was sitting behind the office counter watching the small TV Linda kept back there when I saw headlights sweep across the parking lot and stop near the highway post. The vehicle wasn't one I recognized, an old tan pickup, maybe a Ford. The engine cut off, and I could see a figure get out, moving slow. The man had on a dark jacket and a cap pulled low over his face. He walked to the post and started stapling something up. At first I thought maybe he was with the sheriff's office, but they usually came in the daytime. After a minute, curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside. The night air was cold and dry, and the highway stretched out empty in both directions. No sound but the wind through the sagebrush. The man was still at the post when I called out to him, asking if he needed any help. He didn't look up. I walked closer. The gravel crunched under my boots. I could see his hands working the stapler, slow and steady, pressing each corner of the paper into the post. I was maybe 10 feet away when he stopped. He turned, not fast or startled, just turned like he'd been waiting for me to come closer. His face was shadowed, but his eyes caught the light from my flashlight. Gray, dull, empty. He didn't speak, didn't even really look at me. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, holding it out like he wanted me to take it. I hesitated, then reached for it. The paper felt cold, almost damp. Before I could ask anything, he turned and started walking toward the open desert beyond the ditch, past the rusted wire fence that marked the edge of the property. I watched him go until he was swallowed by the darkness. I figured maybe he was drunk or high, or just another lost soul wandering this part of the state. I looked down at the paper he'd given me. I unfolded it. It was completely blank. No writing, no print, no marks of any kind. Just white paper that looked like it had come straight out of a printer. I remember standing there for a while, confused. The wind picked up and the sign above the office started humming. I thought about calling the sheriff, but it seemed pointless. People came and went around here all the time, and half of them weren't right in the head. When I finally went back inside, I set the blank paper on the counter and locked the door. I couldn't sleep much that night. I kept thinking about the way he'd walked off into nothing, not looking back, not even stumbling like someone who didn't know where they were going. By morning, the pickup was gone. No tire tracks in the sand, no sign anyone had been there. But when I stepped outside to make my rounds, I saw a new flyer on the post. It was still fresh, corners tight against the wood, the paper crisp. I didn't need to get close to know whose face was on it. It was the same man from the night before. The photo showed him standing somewhere in daylight, maybe in front of a camper or small trailer, with that same cap and jacket. Below it, the words read, "Missing since October 17th, last seen near US 50. That date was yesterday. I just stood there staring at it. My hands went cold even though the sun was already warming the asphalt. I looked around the lot. Just emptiness, the open desert, the low sound of the wind in the distance. I checked the paper he'd given me again. It was gone from the counter. I don't remember moving it or throwing it away. I checked the trash bins, my pockets, the floor behind the counter. Nothing. It was like I'd never had it. That whole day I kept waiting for something. Maybe a deputy car, maybe another vehicle pulling in asking questions. But nothing came. The trucker left around noon, and by sunset the place was empty again. I didn't even want to go outside, but I forced myself to check the post after dark. The flyer was still there, flapping softly in the wind. Over the next week I couldn't stop thinking about it. I asked Linda if she'd seen anyone posting flyers before, but she just shrugged. "They've been doing that for years," she said. "Highways long, people go missing." She didn't seem interested. I started noticing small things after that. My tools not where I left them. Doors I knew I'd locked standing slightly open. Footprints in the dust behind the shed, leading off toward the desert. One morning I found the gate hanging crooked like someone had tried to climb it in the night. I told myself it was animals. Coyotes, maybe. But the footprints were human. 2 weeks later, another flyer appeared. Different person this time. A woman, probably mid-30s. Missing since October 31st. I took it down the next day, but by morning another had replaced it. Same woman. Same photo. I stopped going near the post after that. I didn't want to know who'd gone missing or when. But every Friday I'd glance out the window and see a new paper up there. And I couldn't help thinking of the man's eyes in the flashlight beam. Gray and lifeless, staring back at me before he vanished into the desert. By winter. The motel shut down for good. Linda couldn't afford to keep it open anymore. I packed up my things and left. When I drove out that last morning, I slowed near the highway post. A single flyer was there, hanging crooked in the wind. It wasn't for the man. It wasn't for the woman. It was someone else entirely. It was me. My name, my photo, one Linda must have taken from my employee file. Missing since November 23rd, it said. I sat there in the truck with the engine running, staring at my own face on the paper, printed and stapled just like all the others. The sun was coming up behind the mountains, and the wind kept pulling at the corners of the flyer, making it slap gently against the post. I looked out toward the desert, the same direction that man had walked months ago. It stretched out endless, pale and empty, but there were faint tracks cutting through the sand, fresh ones leading out past the fence. I don't know why, but I followed them for a while, just walking, the cold air biting at my skin. After a few minutes, they disappeared into the dust. When I turned back, the motel looked smaller than ever. Like it wasn't even real anymore. That was the last time I saw it. Sometimes, when I drive that stretch of highway again, I still slow down near where it used to stand. The building's gone now, torn down years back. But the post is still there. And sometimes, even from the road, I can see the white shape of a paper flapping in the wind. The owner paid me under the table to cover the 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. shift at the small gas station on Highway 54. It was one of those places you could drive past without noticing. Just a single pump island. a flickering fluorescent sign that buzzed constantly, and a little office that smelled like old coffee and tire cleaner. The pay wasn't much, but I needed cash fast, and he didn't ask questions. The nights were slow. Most of the time it was just me and the hum of insects outside. Sometimes a car or two would stop for gas or cigarettes, but mostly it was silence. The kind of silence that starts to press in after a few hours, especially when the clock crawls past midnight and your mind starts picking up every sound. The creak of the cooler door, the faint ticking from the sign outside, the soft clicking of the old clock above the counter. That night it had rained earlier, short hard bursts that left everything slick and dark. By the time I came in for my shift, the air was thick and cool. I had a thermos of coffee, a stack of old magazines, and my phone that barely picked up a signal. The road out front was empty, stretching into the black woods on both sides. The first few hours passed like they always did. A couple of truckers stopped around 11. One woman came in for cigarettes at midnight, and after that it was dead quiet. I walked outside every now and then just to stretch my legs. The smell of wet asphalt hung heavy in the air. The buzzing from the sign made everything feel a little off, like I was standing in a dream. Around 3 a.m., I was sitting behind the counter half asleep, flipping through an old newspaper, when I heard tires crunching on the gravel. I looked up and saw headlights pull into the lot, slow and steady. It was an old pickup, dark blue, maybe black, with a bit of rust on the sides. It stopped at pump 2, about 30 feet from the window. I waited for the door to open, but it didn't. The driver just sat there. At first I figured he was counting cash or checking something, so I gave it a minute. When nothing happened, I put on my jacket and stepped outside. The air had that damp chill that comes right before dawn, and there was still a faint mist rising off the pavement. The fluorescent sign flickered above me, lighting up the lot in bursts of blue-white light. I walked toward the truck, trying to make out the driver's face through the window. He was sitting perfectly still, staring toward the road. His head was slightly turned, like he was watching something out past the station. I stopped about 6 feet away and waited, expecting him to notice me, but he didn't move. Not a twitch. I said something like, "Need help?" But my voice came out weak, almost like I didn't want him to hear. No reaction. I got closer, close enough to see that the engine wasn't running. There was no exhaust, no sound at all. The windshield was streaked with dried rain, and through it I could see the man's face. It looked pale in the flickering light, his eyes half hidden by the brim of a hat. Then I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. The key wasn't in the ignition. The dashboard lights were off. The engine was stone cold. I could see the condensation inside the glass, like it hadn't been started in hours. Something about it felt wrong. The man's posture was stiff, like someone had set him there. I backed away slowly, trying not to make noise. My pulse started to pick up, and I could feel the back of my neck prickling. I turned around and walked quickly toward the door, keeping my eyes on the glass the whole time. When I got inside, I locked the door and reached for the phone. The owner had one of those old desk phones behind the counter. The line always had a bit of static, but it worked. I called the sheriff's department, told them what I saw, and they said someone would be out soon. The minutes crawled by after that. I didn't take my eyes off the window. The truck just sat there, headlights off, driver frozen in that same position. The fluorescent light kept flickering over it, each flash making it look slightly different, like it might start moving any second. By the time I saw the sheriff's cruiser pull in, my nerves were shot. I felt this weird relief, like finally something was about to make sense. The cruiser's headlights washed over the truck, and I watched from the window as the sheriff stepped out and started toward it. I looked down for maybe 2 seconds, just long enough to grab my jacket, then looked up again. The truck was gone, completely gone. I ran outside thinking maybe I'd missed it pulling away, but there was no sound, no taillights, nothing. The lot was empty except for the puddles reflecting the sign's flicker. The sheriff was standing near pump 2, looking as confused as I felt. The only proof it had ever been there were the tire tracks, too fresh, dark lines pressed into the wet gravel. He walked the perimeter, checked behind the dumpsters, even shined his flashlight into the ditch by the road. Nothing. The tracks led in, stopped by the pump, and that was it. No exit marks. Just the same wet ground where the rain had pooled. When he came inside to ask what happened, I couldn't give him much. I told him what I saw. How the engine was cold, how the man never moved. He wrote everything down, then said maybe the truck rolled off when I wasn't looking. But I knew it didn't. The sound would have woken the dead on a night that quiet. After he left, I stayed inside and didn't move until dawn. The rain had started again just before sunrise, washing out the tire tracks. By the time the owner showed up to open, the lot looked untouched, like nothing had ever been there. For a few nights after that, I tried not to think about it, but I kept replaying that image of the man in the truck, still silent, looking out at the road. There was something about how calm he looked that got under my skin, like he wasn't lost or scared or waiting for help, just watching. A week later, I was sweeping up by the back door when I noticed muddy prints along the edge of the pavement near Pump 2. They were faint, like someone had walked there after the last rain, barefoot maybe. The toes pressed deep into the dirt. The prints led toward the road and then disappeared into the ditch. I followed them for a while, until they faded into the gravel shoulder. From there, the highway stretched on in both directions, empty and silent. The same stretch the man had been staring at. The owner never mentioned anything about it. I didn't either. I finished out the month, collected my pay in cash, and didn't take another shift. But sometimes driving that road late at night, I still glanced toward that old station. The sign's still there, flickering against the dark, and the pumps are long shut down. If you look close, you can see the patch of gravel where the rain doesn't seem to wash away. The spot where the truck sat. The spot where the tire tracks never really faded. No matter how many storms passed, and every time I pass it, I slow down without meaning to, watching that empty lot under the buzzing light, half expecting to see that old pickup again, parked quiet at Pump 2, with the driver still staring at the road, waiting for something that never comes. It was mid-October, the air sharp and thin with that dry chill that settles over the pines before winter. I'd gone hiking around Baxter Lake that evening, pushing later than I should have. The sun dipped faster than I expected behind the ridge, and by the time I started back, the sky was already turning that washed-out blue that means night's coming fast. The woods were still, no crickets, no frogs, just the soft crunch of my boots on the dirt trail. I remember thinking how much darker it got near the lake. The way the pines seemed to crowd in tighter, their branches tangled in black against the sky. I'd parked at the north trailhead, near the old logging road that used to run past the lake and over the bridge. The bridge hadn't been used in years. Everyone in town knew not to cross it. It was chained off and half collapsed. The center bowed like a broken spine. People said it had been unsafe since the late 90s. After a truck carrying cut timber went through the middle and into the river. Nobody died, but it was enough that they shut it down for good. The county never got around to tearing it out. They just left it to rot. When I got close to the fork that led toward the bridge, I noticed something strange. Through the trees ahead, there was a glow, faint and yellow, flickering the way flame does when wind brushes it. At first I thought it was a fire, maybe a campfire by the river. But it wasn't the right color or shape. It hung in one place, steady. I stopped and listened. Nothing, just the sound of my own breath and the faint rush of the river below. My first thought was that someone might be stuck or signaling for help. It was getting cold and the temperature was dropping fast. The lake road was miles from any house and nobody came out there after dark unless they were hunting or lost. I followed the faint light through the trees until I came out onto the old road. The gravel was half buried under moss and grass. The chain across the road hung loose, one side unhooked like someone had moved it. Ahead, the bridge stretched out into the darkness, its rails splintered and leaning. And there, right in the middle, was a lantern. It swung gently, hanging from one of the crossbeams. The flame inside was real, soft, steady, old-fashioned. It looked like something out of another time. I hesitated at the edge of the bridge. The wood under me creaked when I put my weight on it. The smell of wet rot and river mud came up from below. The boards were warped and blackened in spots, soft where rain had soaked through over the years. I thought about turning back, but that lantern kept moving just slightly, like someone had touched it not long ago. I stepped forward carefully. Each board flexed under me, the sound dull and hollow. About 10 feet in, I started hearing something underneath. Not water, not at first. It was metal, faint but distinct, scraping or dragging against wood, like chains shifting somewhere below the planks. I froze, leaning slightly to one side, trying to see between the gaps. The space beneath the bridge was pitch dark, the reflection of the lantern flickering on the river's surface. Then came the sound, something heavy breaking the surface of the water, not a splash like a fish. Heavier, slow, deliberate. It came from directly beneath me. The chains rattled again, faster this time, followed by another deep splash, closer. My stomach turned over. Every instinct in me said, "Get off the bridge." I didn't think. I just ran. The boards thudded under my boots, the old wood groaning and flexing as I sprinted. The lantern swung wildly in the middle, its light streaking across the rails and the trees. I passed it, the glow flashing across my face for a second, and I caught something in that light. Something dark in the water below. A shape just under the surface, rising and vanishing again. I didn't look back. The sound of my steps mixed with another noise. Water churning, chains scraping against metal. When I reached the far end, I jumped over the last few planks and hit the dirt running. I didn't stop until I reached the trailhead, lungs burning, heart hammering like it was going to rip through my chest. I turned once before leaving the clearing. The bridge was just a black outline against the trees, the lantern still swinging in the middle like it was waving goodbye. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I kept hearing that sound again. The slow drag of chains, the heavy splash. It didn't make sense. Maybe it was an animal tangled in something, or someone dumping old equipment into the river. But the timing of it, the precision of those sounds, it didn't feel random. It felt like something responding to me. The next morning I went back. I told myself it was just curiosity, but really it was because I couldn't stop thinking about it. I wanted to see what I'd actually heard. The air was cold and bright, the lake calm as glass. The old road looked normal in daylight, quiet and harmless. When I reached the bridge, I stopped short. The chain across the road had been hooked back into place, and not just hooked. There was a new padlock on it, shiny and clean, like it had been put there recently. The kind of lock you'd have to buy, not something that had been sitting out for years. I stepped closer, hands on the cold metal, and looked out across the bridge. The lantern was gone, not a trace of it. No glass shards, no soot, no burned fuel smell, nothing. The boards where it had hung were damp, but that was it. I crouched near the edge, looking down through the gaps. The river below was murky, slow-moving, thick with silt. But near the middle, I noticed something faint under the surface. It wasn't clear enough to make out at first, but as the current shifted, I saw it. Long, dark, and thin. A chain stretched across the riverbed, half buried in mud. I followed it with my eyes until it disappeared beneath the shadow of the bridge. The same place I'd heard it move the night before. I stared at that water for a long time, trying to piece it together. Maybe it had been part of the old logging operation, chains used to guide timber down the river. Maybe they'd been forgotten when the bridge was abandoned. That made sense. At least it was the only thing that did. But even then, it didn't explain everything. The chain had moved and something big had been under there. Too big to be debris or fish. Maybe a deer had fallen in and gotten tangled. Maybe someone dumped something heavy. I tried to tell myself that. Still, the new lock bothered me more than anything else. Somebody had been there after me, late at night or early in the morning, and they didn't want anyone crossing again. It was too specific, too deliberate. The chain was tight, the lock spotless, and the air around that bridge felt wrong, like it was holding its breath. I left after that. I walked the long way around the lake instead of crossing back, cutting through the old access trail to the highway. I didn't see another person the whole way out. When I got home, I sat in my car for a while before going inside. staring at the dirt still clinging to my boots. I never told anyone about it. Not my friends who fish at the lake. Not the rangers who drive by once in a while. There wasn't anything to say that wouldn't sound strange. But every time I drive past Baxter Lake now, I glance toward that old logging road. The chain still hangs across it, and sometimes when the sun's low, it catches on something. Metal, maybe, glinting in the trees. I never went back again after that day. But I'll never forget the sound that night, the slow, heavy splash of something rising from the dark water, and the rattle of those chains moving just beneath my feet, like whatever was down there knew exactly where I was. Fairview barely had 300 people, maybe a few less by now. It was one of those towns where you recognized every truck that passed, and every bark belonged to a dog you knew by name. Most folks kept to themselves, not out of rudeness, but because there wasn't much else to do. I lived at the edge of town, on an old gravel road that looped around the south side. My closest neighbor, Mr. Larkin, lived 2 lots over. He was retired, maybe in his late 60s, tall, thin, with a faded ball cap always pushed down low on his head. I'd see him most days sitting on his porch in that same metal chair, a cup of coffee balanced on the armrest, just watching the road. He didn't wave much. He'd just look, always watching, like he was waiting for something to come down the road that never did. His house sat on a small rise, old and square with yellow paint peeling off in long strips. The front yard was cluttered with a rusted lawnmower, a couple of milk crates, and a bird bath that hadn't seen water in years. At night, his porch light stayed on until exactly 10, then went dark. It was one of those details I never really thought about until later. You notice patterns when they're broken. That night, it was late October, maybe a week before Halloween. The sky was cloudless, the kind of clear where you can see every star and the air bites your nose. I'd just come in from taking out the trash when I noticed something strange out the kitchen window. Mr. Larkin's house was lit up. Not just the porch, but every single room. The glow made the trees around his place stand out like silhouettes. It looked wrong somehow. I'd lived next to him for almost 5 years, and never once had I seen more than a single light on inside. At first, I figured maybe he had company, but the longer I looked, the more it nagged at me. It was nearly 11. And Fairview wasn't the kind of place where people stayed up late visiting. Besides, there weren't any cars in his driveway. Just his old Ford Ranger sitting crooked near the shed. The longer I stared, the more uneasy I felt. The stillness of everything made it worse. No sound of a TV, no movement behind the windows, just that solid, unnatural glow in the middle of the dark. I stood there debating with myself, trying to find a reason to ignore it. But I couldn't. Curiosity, maybe concern, I don't know which pushed harder. I grabbed a flashlight, slipped on a jacket, and started down the gravel road toward his house. The crunch of the stones under my boots seemed louder than usual. The air smelled faintly of wood smoke and frost. Somewhere far off, a dog barked once, then stopped. When I got closer, I could see his screen door swaying slightly in the breeze. The main door behind it was wide open. I stopped at the edge of the porch, shining my light through the doorway. The TV was on, blasting static so loud I could feel it in my chest. That kind of sharp hissing snow you don't hear much anymore unless something's wrong. "Mr. Larkin?" I called out, though the sound barely carried over the noise. Nothing. I stepped inside, the wooden floor creaking under my boots. The air was warm, too warm, and had a strange smell like burnt coffee and syrup. The living room looked normal at first glance. The old plaid couch, a stack of newspapers on the coffee table, an ashtray full of cigarette butts. But the lamp was on. The ceiling light was on. The TV blaring, and I could hear another radio or something coming from deeper in the house. Every light in every room was on full blast. The kitchen was where it really hit me. The table was set for 2. Plates of pancakes, butter melting on top, syrup drizzled across, steam still curling up like they'd just been made. 2 mugs of coffee, both still hot. One chair pushed back slightly, the other pulled out like someone had just stood up. There were no signs of struggle, No spilled coffee, no broken dishes. Just that eerie sense that two people had been sitting there minutes before I walked in, and then they were gone. The stove was still on, one burner glowing orange. A half-used carton of eggs sat open on the counter. There was a faint ticking from the wall clock, steady and calm. Everything about it felt so wrong because it was so ordinary. I checked the hallway, the bathroom, the bedroom, empty. The bed was made, slippers neatly beside it. His jacket hung on the back of the door. I don't know how long I stood there just listening. The hum of the refrigerator, the static from the TV, the faint rattle of the screen door. No footsteps, no voices, nothing moving anywhere. When I finally stepped back outside, I noticed something else. The light in the shed was on too. I walked toward it, gravel crunching softly underfoot. The door was half open, the inside glowing with that sickly yellow bulb light. The shed smelled of oil and old wood. Tools hung neatly on the wall. A workbench lined with jars full of screws and bolts. Everything in its place. I half expected to find him in there, maybe working late on something. But it was just as empty as the house. I backed out, closing the door behind me. The light flickered once, then steadied. I called the sheriff's office when I got home. It took them nearly an hour to get there. By the time they arrived, the lights at Larkin's place had gone out. All of them at once, like someone had flipped the main breaker. The deputies checked everything. They found no sign of Mr. Larkin. No signs of foul play, no tracks, no note. The pancakes were still there, though cold by then. For 2 days, his house stayed lit up like that. Every room blazing, the TV still spitting static through the night. People in town started talking. A few said he'd just left. Others thought maybe he'd wandered off into the fields and gotten lost. Search teams combed the woods, but nothing turned up. On the second night, around dusk, I was sitting on my porch, staring at his place again. The lights were still on, but something about the glow seemed dimmer, like the bulbs were dying. Then, without warning, everything went dark. No flicker, no fade, just gone. The kind of darkness that eats the edges of things. I thought maybe the power had gone out, but my house still had lights. So did the others up the road. Only his place was dark. The sheriff came back the next morning with an electrician to check the wiring. The man came out shaking his head, said the breaker box was fine, but the lines feeding into the house were dead. He followed them down the pole and realized something odd. The wires had been cut clean about 2 feet from the meter. Not frayed, not chewed, just cut neat and deliberate. The sheriff asked me if I'd noticed anyone around. I hadn't, no strange cars, no people walking. In Fairview, if someone so much as jogged by, you'd hear about it. But there'd been nothing. After that, the town more or less stopped talking about it. The sheriff filed it as a missing person case. The property sat empty, slowly falling apart. By the next spring, the roof had started to sag, and weeds swallowed the yard. Someone nailed a for sale sign to the post, but no one ever bought it. Sometimes, late at night, I still catch myself looking out the window toward where his porch light used to glow. There's nothing there now, just darkness. No hum of electricity, no glow in the windows. The house looks smaller than I remember, like it's sinking into the ground. Every now and then, someone passing through will ask about the old Larkin place. Say they saw it once on the way into town and wondered why it's abandoned. I usually just tell them the truth. The man who lived there disappeared one night, and the lights went out 2 days later. But there's one thing I never mention. The morning after the lights died, I went for a walk down by the fence line behind his property. It was cold, the grass slick with frost. I found something small and pale lying in the dirt near the ditch. At first I thought it was a rock, but when I bent down, I realized it was a ceramic coffee mug, half buried, with a faint ring of dried syrup at the bottom. It looked exactly like the ones from his kitchen table. I left it there and never went back. The train tracks ran right behind the old paper mill, cutting straight through the center of town like a scar. The mill had been shut down for years, but the smell of pulp and wet wood still hung in the air when the wind came from the west. The tracks were my shortcut home after night shifts at the diner. I worked there 6 nights a week when I was 19, bussing tables and scrubbing floors until close. The place shut down at midnight, and I'd usually clock out around 12:30, my shoes still damp from the mop bucket, my pockets heavy with tips that barely got me through the week. The walk home took about 20 minutes. The streets were quiet at that hour. No traffic, no voices, just the hum of the fluorescent streetlights and the sound of my own footsteps. The diner sat on the edge of town, and after a few blocks, the concrete gave way to gravel and weeds. The air always felt different back there. Cooler, cleaner, touched with pine from the woods beyond the mill. The tracks shimmered faintly under the moonlight, 2 silver lines stretching off into the dark, always disappearing into the same black tree line. That night, the sky was overcast. It was late August, still warm but heavy with humidity. I'd worked a double shift and felt that strange mix of exhaustion and restlessness that comes when you're too tired to sleep. My uniform smelled like fry oil, and I wanted the walk to clear my head before I got home. I didn't bring a flashlight, just trusted the moonlight and the glow from the mill's old security lights that still flickered sometimes, even though nobody worked there anymore. The gravel crunched under my sneakers as I stepped onto the tracks. To my left, the mill loomed like a shadow, huge and dead, its windows either broken or boarded. I'd always found it eerie, but it was a familiar kind of eerie. Everyone in town grew up with that building there, abandoned but somehow still part of the place. Some said homeless people used it for shelter. Others said teens went there to drink. I never saw anyone inside. The frogs were loud that night, their croaks coming from the ditch along the side of the tracks. The smell of wet dirt mixed with the faint metallic tang of the rails. I walked, keeping my head down, counting ties out of habit, trying to stay balanced. The night was quiet, except for insects and the distant hum of the diner's sign far behind me. About halfway home, near the bend where the tracks curved behind a line of pine trees, I noticed someone up ahead. At first, I thought it was just a post or a shadow. But as I kept walking, I could tell it was a person, standing right in the center of the tracks. He wasn't moving, just standing still facing my direction. I slowed down. My first thought was maybe it was someone drunk, maybe one of the factory workers who lived nearby. But the longer I looked, the stranger it felt. The figure didn't move or shift at all, not even when I got close enough to make out that it was a man. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing what looked like dark work clothes, maybe a flannel or a jacket, and boots that glinted faintly under the light. Felt that uneasy instinct that tells you something's wrong before your brain catches up. The air around me felt heavy, and I could hear my own breathing. I stopped walking. The man just stood there unmoving, facing me. Then as I hesitated, he turned slightly, just enough to show the side of his face. I couldn't see his features clearly, just the outline of his jaw, the curve of his cheek. The night seemed to hold still for a second. Then he turned fully toward me, and I swear I heard him say something. The words were low, not loud or sharp, but clear enough to understand. He said, "You shouldn't be here." I froze. My heart started hammering. Before I could react, I blinked, just a normal blink. And when my eyes opened, the man was gone. The tracks were empty. The spot where he'd been standing was bare, nothing there but the gravel and the rails shining faintly in the moonlight. I stood still for a long moment, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. I told myself maybe he'd just stepped off the tracks quickly, into the trees. But it hadn't made any sound. No crunch of gravel, no movement, nothing. The silence felt unnatural, like the whole night was waiting for me to do something. I decided to turn around. I wasn't going to keep walking that way, not after that. I took a step back, then another. That's when I noticed something that made my stomach drop. In the dirt between the rails, there were fresh boot prints. Big ones. They were behind me, pressed deep into the gravel, leading in the direction I had come from. They weren't mine. I was wearing sneakers and the tread didn't match. I looked at them closely. The pattern crisp and new, like whoever made them had been walking just moments before. The tracks went on for a while, then stopped abruptly, fading where the gravel turned to dirt. I felt that instinct again, the one that tells you to move. I didn't look back anymore. I walked fast, almost jogging, keeping my eyes straight ahead until I reached the crossing by Main Street. The lights from the few stores still on overnight felt like safety. When I finally got home, I locked my door, something I usually forgot to do. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that man standing there, not moving, not saying anything until the very last second. I tried to tell myself I was just tired, that maybe it had been a trick of the light or my brain playing with the shadows. The next morning, I woke up to messages on my phone. People were talking about something that had happened on the tracks. Someone had been hit by the freight train that came through around 2 a.m. That's the same time I was out there. They said the train crew didn't see him until it was too late. They found a single work boot lodged in the gravel, torn from the impact. The rest of him was taken away before sunrise. I went down there later that day, when the police were gone. The air smelled like iron and wet wood. There was still a bit of caution tape fluttering in the breeze caught on a bush. The gravel was disturbed, dark in some spots, and there were deep impressions where the wheels had screeched. Near the bend just before the pine trees, I found a single boot print pressed into the dirt. It looked the same as the ones I'd seen the night before. I stood there for a long time, looking down the tracks toward the mill. The sun was bright, but the place still felt wrong. I thought about the man I'd seen, about how he'd stood there without moving, and how the boot prints had been fresh, heading the same way I had come. It took a few weeks before I could walk that route again, and even then I avoided looking too far down the line. The diner eventually closed that fall, and I moved out of town not long after. But sometimes, when I visit family and drive past that part of town, I still glance toward the mill. The tracks are rusted now, half buried in weeds. They say the train doesn't even run through there anymore. Still, whenever I think about that night, I can't help but wonder if the man I saw wasn't someone long dead, but someone still alive back then, lost, wandering those same tracks just minutes before the train came. Maybe he wasn't warning me about ghosts or curses or anything like that. Maybe he was just another tired man working too late, trying to get home. And somehow in that dark and quiet space our paths crossed. One of us already too late to turn back. I started volunteering at the old Methodist church in late March, mostly because I needed something to do on weekends. My job was simple: repaint the basement walls. The pastor told me they were getting ready for Easter, trying to make the place look fresh for the Sunday crowd. The church itself sat on the edge of town, a tall, pale brick building that looked solid from the outside, but smelled like dust and old paper inside. Every hallway seemed to echo longer than it should. The basement was even worse. A long, low-ceilinged maze of rooms with concrete floors and yellowed light bulbs that buzzed faintly. When I first went down there, I noticed how cold it was. The kind of chill that stuck to your clothes. I brought a small radio to play while I worked, but even with music playing, it felt too quiet. The pastor said the basement used to be used for youth gatherings and storage, but lately, it had been mostly forgotten. I believed that. Everything down there had that look of being untouched for years. I started by clearing space along the west wall, stacking boxes filled with hymnals, old bulletins, and Christmas decorations from who knows when. The paint on the walls had bubbled and cracked in places. I scraped it off, primed, and rolled a new coat of white paint. It took a few days to make real progress, but I didn't mind. It was peaceful, in a strange way, being down there with only the sound of the roller moving across the wall. On my fourth day, while I was moving another pile of boxes near the far corner, I noticed something odd. A small wooden door partly hidden behind stacked hymnals and a broken folding table. It wasn't even full height, maybe 5 feet tall, painted the same faded color as the wall. I thought it was just another old storage space, but when I checked the building plans tacked up in the supply room later that day, I didn't see it marked anywhere. That bothered me. Curiosity got the better of me. The next morning I brought a flashlight and cleared the boxes away completely. The door had no knob, just a small latch. When I opened it, a sharp draft of cold, stale air hit me. the kind that smells of wet concrete and something metallic. I shined my light inside. The space beyond looked like another small basement room, though the ceiling was lower. The air felt heavier, thicker somehow. I stepped inside slowly. The floor was bare concrete, a little uneven and damp in spots. Rows of metal folding chairs filled the space, maybe 20 or 30 of them, all facing the same direction, toward a blank section of wall. Nothing hung there, no cross, no projector, nothing. Just a plain, rough surface. On the floor in front of the chairs were faint white chalk markings. They looked like symbols or maybe scribbled drawings. Some were circles, some crosses, and in the center, a string of numbers, 41206. The chalk looked fresh, like it had been drawn not long ago. I stood there for a long time, not sure what I was looking at. It didn't look like part of any church activity I'd ever seen. The chairs were clean too, no dust, no spider webs. Someone had been using that room recently. I noticed one more thing. A faint smell of smoke or something burned. Not strong, but there, mixed with the dampness. I didn't tell anyone. I just closed the door, stacked the boxes back in front of it, and tried to keep working. But I couldn't stop thinking about that date. April 12th, it was 3 days away. I didn't know why someone would write it like that on the floor. It looked deliberate, centered between the markings. That night I kept replaying it in my head. The setup of the chairs, the way they were all lined perfectly straight. The symbols, the stale air, the burned smell. It didn't feel like something innocent. It felt like something planned, something secret. When I went back the next morning, I walked straight to that corner again. The door was still there, still shut, but I hesitated to open it. Instead, I just stood there staring at it, trying to think if I should tell the pastor. But what would I even say? Hey, I found a hidden room with chalk drawings and chairs facing a wall. It sounded ridiculous, like something from a bad movie. I forced myself to finish the last section of painting, but I could barely focus. Every creak in the basement made me look over my shoulder. At one point, I thought I heard movement behind the wall. Maybe pipes or the furnace, but it didn't sound mechanical. It sounded like a single shuffle, a drag of something across the floor. By the time I finished that day, I'd made up my mind. I didn't want to go back. I left the brushes and rollers there and went home. That night, I didn't sleep much. My mind kept drifting to that small door, those symbols, and that date written on the concrete. The next morning, I called the pastor and said I couldn't keep volunteering. I didn't give a reason. He just said, "That's all right," and hung up. For the next few days, I tried to forget about it. April 12th came faster than I realized. It was a Wednesday. I remember because I woke up early for work and noticed it was raining. Steady, cold rain. Around noon, the clouds cleared, and the day felt strangely still. Nothing unusual happened. I almost laughed to myself later that evening, thinking about how nervous I'd been over some chalk markings. Then, at around 4:30 that morning, my phone buzzed with a news alert. Fire breaks out at Fairview Methodist Church. The article said the blaze started sometime around 4 a.m. in the basement and spread quickly through the structure. The fire department said they didn't find anyone inside, but the lower level had been completely destroyed. The cause was still under investigation. I couldn't stop staring at the screen. The time and date stuck out. April 12th, 4 in the morning. To look in, it was too exact. I tried to convince myself it was coincidence, that someone maybe just used that date for something else. But it didn't add up. The pastor survived, but he lost his office and all the church records. The story said they suspected faulty wiring, though no one could explain how it spread so fast. A few days later, I drove by the site. The building was a blackened shell, half collapsed with yellow tape around it. The air still smelled of burned wood and wet ash. The basement windows were dark and cracked, but as I stood there looking at them, I remembered exactly where that hidden door would have been, just under the far corner where the wall had caved in. Something about the fire didn't look natural. The burn marks on the bricks around that section were darker, deeper, like the heat had been stronger there. I stood by my car for a long time before leaving, watching smoke rise in faint threads from the ruins. I never told anyone about the room. Not the pastor, not the firefighters, not anyone. I told myself maybe it really was some old meeting space. Maybe the date meant nothing. But I knew what I saw. The clean chairs, the chalk symbols, the smell of something already burned. And now that whole place was gone, reduced to ash right on that exact date. Every year since then, I've remembered that day when April rolls around. I don't drive near the site anymore, even though they rebuilt the church years later. They paved the new parking lot over the old basement. Whenever I pass through town and see that new building standing there, clean and bright, I can't help but think about what was sealed underneath. The way the air changed when I opened that small door. The way it felt like the room had been waiting for something to happen. And somehow, it finally did. Everyone in town knew about the Lambert house. It sat at the end of Old Quarry Road, half hidden behind a stand of bare oaks, its roof sagging, its porch leaning forward like it was tired of standing. The siding had peeled down to gray wood, and the second-story windows were punched out by time, or kids with BB guns. The place had been empty for at least 15 years. People said old man Lambert hanged himself in the barn after his wife left. Others said his youngest kid went missing in the woods behind it. Nobody ever proved anything, but the house just sat there year after year, sinking into itself. When you're 17, though, cursed just means nobody's gonna stop you. It was a Friday night in early October, cold enough for your breath to show, and my buddy Jesse had gotten his older brother to buy us a case of beer. There were 6 of us, all packed into Tyler's rusted pickup, music blasting, headlights cutting through the dark. The Lambert place had been a dare since we were 12. Everyone said you could see lights move in the upper windows. That night it was just a place far enough out that nobody would hear us. The driveway was more of a ditch, overgrown with weeds and old tire ruts. We parked halfway down it because Tyler didn't trust the ground. The house looked bigger up close, especially with the moon behind it. The front door was still on, but it hung crooked. When we went in, the smell hit first. Mildew, rot, something sweet like old insulation. The floor was soft in places. We set up our little Bluetooth speaker on the counter in what used to be the kitchen and cracked the first cans open. The wallpaper was peeling in long strips, yellow flowers turning brown. A refrigerator sat in the corner with its door missing, and a pile of raccoon droppings filled the bottom. I remember brushing dust off a counter and seeing old knife marks in the wood. Someone had tried to sand them down years ago. We laughed at how disgusting everything was, and it felt good, like owning something that had scared us as kids. Outside, the fields stretched empty for miles. You could see the faint glow of town off in the distance, just a dull orange smear. No houses nearby, no lights. The nearest road was half a mile away. That isolation felt like freedom at first. We turned the music up louder, the sound echoing through the empty rooms. By 10, the place was filled with noise. Cans clinking, someone yelling about how the upstairs floor looked ready to cave in, someone else daring another to go check it anyway. The wind had picked up, and it made the whole house creak and groan like it was breathing. Every time a draft came through the broken windows, the sound would change. Faint whistles, rattling glass, a soft hollow sound from somewhere deep in the walls. Around midnight, things started to quiet down. The speaker's battery was dying, and the air inside had gotten colder, heavier somehow. I went to the window for air and looked out toward the trees that lined the road. That's when headlights swept across the trunks. They cut through the dark like a slow wave, then stopped. At first I thought it was someone turning into the driveway, but the lights didn't move again. They just sat there, steady and white. You could see dust floating in them. The others noticed too. For a few minutes everyone stood near the front door, squinting out through the gaps. The sound of an idling engine carried faintly across the field. A low rumble, steady and smooth. Nobody said anything for a while. The first thought was cops. The second was someone trying to mess with us. We waited. The lights didn't move. The engine stayed on. Then Jesse said he thought he saw the driver's door open. I looked again and could make out the dark shape of a car, just off the main road. but it was hard to see details. The door did look open, hanging just wide enough for light to spill onto the grass. Minutes passed. Still no one got out. The idea of a cop didn't fit anymore. No sirens, no flashlight beams, just that steady idle. It was strange how loud it felt even from that far away. The sound seemed to fill the night, even when the wind stopped. After a while, we decided to check. It was better than standing there pretending not to be scared. We grabbed a flashlight and followed the old dirt path that led to the road. The closer we got, the stronger the smell of exhaust got, mixing with cold night air. The grass was wet and tall, brushing our legs. The car was an old sedan, silver maybe, with mud caked along the sides. The engine was still running steady and low, but nobody was inside. The driver's door was wide open, keys dangling from the ignition, a half-empty bottle of orange soda sitting in the cup holder. The headlights threw long shadows across the field. There were no footprints. The ground was soft from rain earlier that week, but not a single mark around the doors or on the shoulder. We looked inside. The seats were clean, no sign of struggle or even use. Just that soda, a cassette in the deck playing a low hiss of static. 'Twasn't radio, not even music, just a blank tape left running. The glove box was open with nothing inside but old registration papers, the kind printed on pink carbon copy forms. The smell of warm oil hung in the air. It didn't make sense. The car was too new to have been sitting there long, and the engine was warm enough that whoever left it had done so minutes before. We waited, shining the flashlight around the trees, calling out once or twice even though none of us wanted to. Nothing moved. No sounds except the idle. That's when it hit me how dark it really was beyond the headlights. The woods swallowed everything. You couldn't tell how far they went or what might have been in there. Something about the open door, the way it faced the trees like someone had just stepped out and vanished. It made the air feel heavier again, like in the house before. We didn't talk about it. We just shut the car door, turned off the ignition, and left it there. The quiet afterward was worse. No engine, no sound, just crickets and our footsteps in the wet grass. Back at the house, nobody felt like staying. We packed up quick, crushed cans, stuffed trash bags, and left. When we drove past the turnoff, I looked down the road and saw nothing but black. No lights, no car, nothing. The next morning, I drove back alone. Curiosity, maybe. I wanted to see if the car was still there, or if I'd just been too drunk to understand what I'd seen. The air smelled of damp earth and cold metal. The spot where we'd seen the car was empty. Tire marks cut into the shoulder, deep ones like something heavy had spun the wheels before taking off. But what struck me was how the grass around the tracks was flattened in a wide circle, not like someone had driven off, but like the car had sat there idling for a long time, the exhaust blackening the blades. I followed the tracks a little way down the ditch. They ended suddenly, like the ground had swallowed them. I searched for more, for footprints, anything, but the mud was smooth except for the tire ruts. The only thing left was a small piece of paper, torn and damp, half buried. When I picked it up, it was part of an old grocery receipt. The date smeared but readable the day before. I didn't take it with me. I just dropped it back and left. Later that week, I asked around town if anyone had seen a car abandoned out that way. Nobody had. No one reported a missing vehicle either. The Lambert house still stands out there, tilting a little more every year. The weeds have grown taller around it. When I drive past at night, I sometimes catch my headlights on the upper windows. The glass gone, but the frames glinting white for a second before the dark takes them back. I don't believe in curses, but I've never gone back inside. Some places feel wrong in ways you can't explain. Not haunted, not magical, just wrong in the way the air goes still. The way sounds don't echo right. The way an engine can run for hours without anyone behind the wheel. I was 14 the summer I got my first real job. My uncle knew a guy named Jim who managed the old grain elevator just off Highway 283, a few miles outside town. It hadn't been used in years, not since the co-op shut down in the late 90s. The place was tall and gray, with peeling paint and rusted catwalks that looked ready to snap under their own weight. You could see it from the highway, this massive concrete tower standing alone beside a row of empty rail tracks, like a monument to some dead industry. The air around it always smelled faintly of wheat and old oil, a smell that clung to your clothes even after you washed them. Jim was a short man with thin hair and a nervous way about him. His hands were always moving, tapping his thigh, scratching his neck, adjusting his cap. He wore the same faded blue work shirt every day, with his name stitched over the pocket in white thread. He told me he needed help cleaning out the interior, so a construction crew could inspect it before tearing it down later in the year. It was mostly sweeping, shoveling, and hauling out the remains of grain that had hardened into clumps. He warned me right off the bat not to go near the lower hoppers because of bad footing. He said some of the metal grates were corroded, and if I fell through, I could get hurt. That was enough to keep me cautious. The first few days went slow. The elevator was full of dust so thick it hung in the air like fog. You couldn't take a single step without hearing a muffled crunch and feeling the powdery layer cling to your jeans. I'd spend hours sweeping up piles of old wheat husks and mouse droppings, shoveling them into trash bags that Jim would haul off in his truck. The sound of my own breathing filled my ears inside that concrete shell, broken only by the echo of pigeons fluttering in the rafters above. Every time the wind picked up outside, the whole place groaned, metal beams flexing like something alive. There were levels, grinding floors, catwalks, and narrow ladders leading up to where the chutes met. The sunlight cut through the cracks in the siding, sending down shafts of gold that turned the dust into glittering columns. It was beautiful in a strange, forgotten way. But even with all that light, the lower areas stayed dark. They smelled different too. Damp, sour, like mildew and something that had been left too long. I usually worked alone for most of the day. Jim would check in now and then, bringing water or lunch, and sometimes he'd linger like he didn't trust me not to wander. He always made sure to remind me about the hoppers. "Stay on the upper levels," he'd say, not looking me in the eye. "You step wrong down there, you'll regret it." I nodded, but I remember thinking he seemed more afraid of what was down there than of me getting hurt. I didn't say that out loud, though. The day I found the bones, it was brutally hot. Late July, air so heavy it made every breath feel like work. The metal siding popped in the heat, and the dust stuck to my sweat like plaster. I'd been sweeping near one of the grain chutes when my flashlight slipped from my back pocket and rolled toward a grate. I watched it fall straight through and vanish into the shadows below. I leaned over, squinting down into the narrow gap. The beam of light flickered faintly against the side of the hopper, maybe 20 feet below. It looked reachable if I climbed carefully. I hesitated. I remembered Jim's warning, but it didn't seem that dangerous. The metal ladder bolted to the wall looked solid enough, and the drop didn't seem that bad. I told myself I'd just be quick, go down, grab the flashlight, climb back up. I'd done dumber things before. The air got cooler as I descended. The smell changed too, turning musty and stale, like wet grain that had been sealed up for years. My hands came away black with grime from the rungs. The walls were close together, the kind of narrow space that made you feel swallowed by the dark. When I reached the bottom, I saw my flashlight lying against a small pile of debris. I bent down to grab it, then froze. It wasn't just debris. At first, I thought it was animal remains. Maybe a raccoon or stray dog that had fallen in and died. But when I leaned closer, I saw the bones were arranged in a way that didn't make sense for an animal. The shape of the ribs, the curve of the spine, the small, perfect fingers of a hand partly buried in the dust. The bones were pale and dry, like they'd been there a long time. Next to them was a shoe, small and old-fashioned, the kind kids used to wear decades ago. The leather had cracked and folded in on itself like a dry leaf. I remember staring at it for a long time. The air felt thick and wrong, like it was pressing against my chest. There was no smell of rot. Nothing living had been down there in years, but I could feel a kind of silence that made my ears ring. The flashlight trembled in my hand. I didn't touch anything. I just backed up slowly, one step at a time, until I reached the ladder again. My legs were shaking as I climbed. When I got to the top, Jim was there. He'd come back while I was down below. I didn't even realize how pale I must have looked until he asked what happened. I told him I'd dropped my flashlight, climbed down, and found something strange. Bones, maybe human. I didn't even finish describing it before his face changed. He went completely white. He didn't move for a few seconds, just stared past me like he'd known this moment would come. Then he told me to stay where I was, turned, and walked outside. I followed him out after a minute. He was leaning against his truck, breathing hard, staring out toward the highway. The cicadas were loud in the weeds, and the heat felt heavier than before. He didn't look at me when he spoke. He just said, "You did good work, kid. Take the rest of the day off. I'll pay you for the week." His voice was low and tight. I started to ask about the bones, but he cut me off. He said, "Forget it. You don't need to come back." Then he climbed into his truck and drove away, leaving me standing in the dust. I rode my bike home, my hands shaking on the handlebars. I told my uncle that Jim said the job was over. I didn't mention the bones. I didn't know how to explain it. And honestly, I wasn't sure anyone would believe me. That night I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that small shoe and those clean, dry bones lying under all that dust. I kept thinking about how deep that hopper was, how hidden it was, how easy it would have been for someone to fall in or be pushed and never get found. The elevator was torn down that winter. I remember seeing the machinery parked out front one day on my way to school, massive yellow excavators tearing into the concrete shell like it was paper. The demolition lasted a week and then it was gone. Nothing left but a flat stretch of gravel and a chain-link fence. People in town said it was about time, that it had been an eyesore for years. Nobody mentioned anything about what they found inside. Once, years later, I drove past the spot again. There's nothing there now, just a field of weeds where the elevator used to stand. But sometimes when the sun hits the dirt just right, you can still see the faint outline of the foundation, a darker square pressed into the ground. I pulled over once and walked to the fence just to look. The air was still, and for a moment I could almost smell that old grain dust again, hear the hollow echo of my boots on the concrete floors. I thought about how easily that flashlight could have rolled a few inches farther, or how, if I hadn't looked down, I never would have known what was buried under all that time and dust. Whoever that was, whoever those bones belonged to, they'd been forgotten for decades, hidden in plain sight, while people worked and laughed and moved on with their lives above them. Maybe Jim knew something, maybe not, but when I think back to how pale he went, how fast he wanted that building gone, I can't help but feel like he did. And now the elevator's gone too, erased like it was never there, and with it, the only real proof of what I saw that summer. All that's left is the memory, the smell of dust, the cool air at the bottom of the hopper, and the small, cracked shoe lying beside a pile of bones that nobody ever claimed.